Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and this is my series, The Emergence of Europe. The Fall of the Roman Empire, the Rise of the Franks, and the Creation of Charlemagne's Empire. Today is episode 6, A Hun Named Attila. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, there were 3 candidates for the position of Generalissimo, but Aetius had won the contest by 433 because he was the only one left alive. The fighting between the rivals had left the province of North Africa vulnerable to a surprise invasion by the Vandals and Alans, who had crossed over from Hispania. North Africa was a big place, so Aetius focused on Gaul, where the Burgundians were convinced to accept an orderly settlement like the Goths. Unfortunately, the Vandals and Alans captured the critical port of Carthage. Since both halves of the empire depended on the region for food supplies, they planned a joint expedition to retake Carthage. However, the expedition was cancelled because the Eastern Empire became preoccupied with the existential threat of the Huns, led by Attila. In the end, the Eastern Roman Empire was saved because Attila had concluded that there were better opportunities in the West, unsurprisingly since he now had a lot of mouths to feed and there was little food left in the Balkans after several years of pillaging. In the spring of 451, his massive army marched west, following the Danube until it penetrated deep into Gaul. Last episode, I explained the system of orderly barbarian settlement. Well, that system faced a major test when Attila led the Huns to invade Gaul. Aetius gathered as many Roman troops as possible, but he also found allies among the Burgundians and the Goths, which may seem strange at first. Actually, the explanation is simple. Like all new homeowners, the Burgundians and the Goths became more conservative now that they had something to conserve. While they would have happily taken advantage of any internal conflict among the Romans to gain better territory, Attila's horde was far too large to be satisfied with a bit of pillaging, so the Goths and the Burgundians fought to defend their homes. When the two sides faced each other on June 30, 451, the battle was a draw, but Attila clearly suffered enough losses that he did not make another attempt to push into Gaul. After a winter of brooding and replaying the battle in his head, Attila was ready for another campaign, although he crossed the Alps to invade Italy this time. While Attila encountered less resistance, the climate proved deadly, and the Huns soon found themselves suffering from disease because they were stuck outside cities during long sieges in the hot summer. Worse, Aetius was attacking from the west, and a new emperor in Constantinople, Marcian, was taking advantage of Attila's absence to reclaim lands in the Balkans. Finally, Attila died in 453 during an epic drinking binge. While Attila's personal power had relied on his leadership of the Huns, he was unstoppable because his coalition included groups like the Gepids and the Goths, led by their own kings but who were vassals of Attila. Quick note. These Goths had submitted to the Huns instead of emigrating to the Roman Empire in 376. Attila's coalition was formidable, but it was organized largely around personal loyalty, so it broke apart when he died in 453. Groups like the Gepids, the Sarmatians, and the Rugi refused to submit to Attila's sons. Instead, they were permitted to settle in the Eastern Roman Empire. Back in the Western Roman Empire, the policy of orderly barbarian settlement had exceeded in its objective, preventing a destructive invasion, so its architect, Aetius, should have felt pride. Roman control of Gaul had become more theoretical than real by this point, so it is a good question whether Aetius could have maintained this policy of controlled immigration for long. We will never know, since he was killed in September 454 on the orders of Emperor Valentinian. Why would the emperor order the death of his generalissimo, especially since he had not expressed any interest in taking Valentinian's position? Okay, this assassination needs an explanation. By the early 450s, it seemed likely that Valentinian and his wife, Eudocia, would not produce any more children. After 15 years of marriage, they had 2 daughters, Eudocia and Placidia. The older daughter had been betrothed to Geiseric's son Huneric, which would give him a claim to the throne, although it is unlikely that Aetius had taken it seriously when he made the arrangement. Anyway, Placidia was available, so Aetius tried hard to convince Valentinian to accept a marriage between Placidia and his son. Honestly, it makes sense. Valentinian needed an heir, and Aetius, otherwise known as the man who had saved the empire from Attila, had a son. However, it is necessary to consider the perspective of Valentinian, who had grown up basically a figurehead watching Aetius dominate the Western Empire, and now Aetius wanted to force his son on the throne? The empire had been in genuine danger when Attila invaded, and Aetius had managed to ensure its survival. But Attila was dead, so maybe Aetius was no longer indispensable. Still, Valentinian needed support, which came from Senator Petronius Maximus and Heraclius, the eunuch head of the emperor's household. Alone with the emperor and Heraclius, Aetius was murdered on September 22nd, 454. Maximus hoped for a reward for his support in the Senate, but Valentinian did not want someone to replace Aetius, so Maximus apparently conspired with officers loyal to Aetius, and they murdered the emperor roughly 6 months later. Maximus certainly wanted to succeed Valentinian as emperor, which he achieved after a very generous donation to the retirement fund of the Roman army. Still, Maximus knew that he needed supporters, so he sent a Gallic aristocrat named Aetius to approach the Goths. Aetius had worked closely with the Goths before, but this approach broke the policy of both Constantius and Aetius, who had both focused on limiting Goth influence in imperial politics. Anyway, it did not actually matter. Maximus had made a dangerous enemy in Gaiseric. Wait, how did Maximus make an enemy of Gaiseric, ruler of faraway Carthage? Well, he broke the heart of Huneric, Geiseric's son. After Valentinian's widow was forced to become his wife, Maximus then forced his new stepdaughter, Eudocia, to marry his son, Palladius, in order to strengthen his son's claim to the throne. This marriage proved dangerous because Eudocia had already been betrothed to Huneric, undoubtedly plunging a heart-sick Huneric into a depression. Teenagers, what are you going to do? Well, if you're king of Carthage, you invade Italy and sack Rome for 2 weeks. It is unknown if Gaiseric planned to kill Maximus or simply force him to release Eudocia, but the matter was settled by the Romans themselves. Faced with a mob of angry Romans furious about the looting of their city, Maximus's guards made no effort to protect their employer, and he was stoned to death 11 weeks after seizing power. Resisting the temptation to make himself emperor, Gaiseric returned home along with an enormous amount of loot and the widowed Empress Eudocia and her daughters, Placidia and Eudocia. It is unknown if Gaiseric had ensured that Eudocia conveniently became a widow or if he simply did not care, but Eudocia married Huneric in 460. Aetius was in the middle of negotiations with the Goths when he learned that his superior was dead. Well, there was a job opening in the executive office, so he rushed to submit his resume. Actually, he did not waste time seeking the approval of the Senate or the military commanders. Remember, he was talking to a king with a large army, so Aetius simply declared himself emperor. After receiving the support of most of the aristocrats in Gaul, he made his way to Rome. The large number of armed Goths behind Aetius made his self-promotion hard to oppose. If the new emperor had focused his attention on Gaul, he might have established stability, but Theodoric's support had a price. While Theodoric had grudgingly accepted the borders imposed by Aetius, he did not intend to stop expanding. In exchange for the Goths' support, Aetius gave King Theodoric permission to march south into Hispania and discipline the Suebi who had been raiding Roman lands. I just need to point out that Theodoric was the son of King Theodoric who had died during the battle with Attila. Actually, this is a good opportunity to explain what had happened in Hispania after the Vandals and Alans had crossed the Straits of Gibraltar to conquer North Africa. Well, the Suebi had gained control of most of Hispania between 439 and 441. They faced no opposition from what remained of the Western Roman Empire because it was focused on retaining control of Gaul. If the Suebi had remained in Hispania, they would have probably been left alone. But Retiarius, king of the Suebi, attacked the surviving imperial lands in northeastern Hispania, believing that the empire was too divided following the assassination of Valentinian. Oddly enough, Retiarius was Theodoric's brother-in-law, but he sacrificed domestic harmony, so the Suebi were crushed in 456. Retiarius was executed and the Suebi kingdom broke into several rival warbands. Divided, they could not resist the Goths, who rapidly gained control of most of Hispania, while the Suebi were confined to a region in the northwest. Anyway, Aetius had secured his rule of the Western Roman Empire, well, what was left of it. Just to recap, Britain had been abandoned, and North Africa had been conquered by the Vandals and the Alans. Admittedly, Gaul was relatively stable, but a sizable part of the region was occupied by several barbarian tribes, while Hispania was divided between Suebi warbands, Goths, and a number of Roman landowners. Only Italy remained untouched. While Aetius had support in Gaul, both among Gaulish senators and from the Goths, he was rejected by both the Senate in Rome and the Eastern Emperor. As a result, his rule was never secure, and he was defeated in 457 by an army led by Majorian and Ricimer, the main army commanders in Italy. A key factor in Aetius's defeat was the refusal of the Goths and the Burgundians to actually fight for him. After obtaining approval from the Eastern Emperor, Majorian became emperor in the West, and Ricimer became his generalissimo. Majorian did well as emperor at first. He soon had firm control of Italy, and Roman troops gained control of southern Gaul, so Majorian actually crossed the Alps to visit Lyon near the end of 458, the first emperor to visit Gaul since Valentinian II. Again, Hispania was considered less important than Gaul or North Africa, so newly crowned Emperor Majorian did not interfere with the Goths' expansion into Hispania. At the same time, he allowed the Burgundians to further expand their territory. Admittedly, each concession reduced the chance for full-scale war, but imperial tax revenue continued to decline. Instead, Majorian assembled a fleet in Cartagena in 460 to reconquer North Africa. If the fleet could transport Majorian's army to North Africa, Geiseric's future was grim. Except, he attacked first and destroyed the Roman fleet. Humiliated, Majorian returned to Italy and was soon killed by his generalissimo Ricimer. Honestly, the coup seems a little strange. Ricimer and Majorian had worked well together for years until Ricimer soured on the relationship. Still, the coup remains difficult to explain. Either Ricimer had always resented Majorian and happily seized an opportunity, or he feared that Majorian would move against him eventually, so he moved first. The former explanation seems more likely, although there are no records of any rivalry. Still, it should not be a surprise that we lack detailed records of the backgrounds of two medium-level generals who had basically survived an endless bloodletting. Anyway, it would be natural to expect that Ricimer had had the blood cleaned off the imperial robes and then announced that there was a new emperor, who was named Ricimer. Except Ricimer proved to be more comfortable as the power behind the throne. While Ricimer may have been uncomfortable with public ceremonies, the primary reason for his refusal to sit on the imperial throne was his ethnic heritage. The genealogical records are not clear, but he was probably the product of a marriage alliance between the Suebi and the Gothic ruling families. There are claims that Wallia was his maternal grandfather, but it is not certain. Still, it is likely that he had a royal connection since his sister had married a member of the Burgundian royal family. Basically, he had royal blood, but it was Gothic, not Roman. Instead, Ricimer appointed Senator Libius Severus emperor, the third since the assassination of Valentinian. When Severus died 4 years later, Ricimer did not appear to be in a hurry to appoint a replacement. After nearly 2 years, the Eastern Emperor lost patience and nominated Anthemius, a general from the East. Actually, Emperor Leo was motivated less by concern for the stability of the Western Roman Empire and more by a desire to get rid of a rival. Anthemius was the son-in-law of Marcian, Leo's predecessor as emperor, and probably considered himself to have a claim to the throne. Unwilling to surrender his throne, Leo gave Anthemius a different throne, conveniently located far away. In fact, it seems clear that the appointment of Anthemius was part of a larger plan to retake much of the Western Empire, which was unlikely to occur under Ricimer since he seemed content with firm control of Italy and a good working relationship with the key barbarian leaders in Gaul. Speaking of the key leaders of Gaul, when Anthemius arrived in 467 with Constantinople's backing to become Western Emperor, he found a change in Goth leadership. Taking advantage of the breakdown in imperial control, Theodoric had expanded the Goth-controlled territory beyond the initial boundaries of the border granted in 418, while maintaining allegiance to Rome. The expanded kingdom stretched across the Pyrenees into Hispania. No disrespect to Theodoric, but the growth had been largely due to the decline of the Western Empire. Still, he had a lot to be proud of, until he was murdered by his brother Euric in 466. Euric had murdered his brother because he wanted to become king of the Goths, and apparently tired of waiting for Theodoric to retire or die. Theodoric had carefully expanded the Goth kingdom without becoming a major threat that would lead to open warfare. Admittedly, the Western Roman Empire had become a pale shadow of its former glory, but Italy could still organize a powerful army if needed. So, Theodoric had expanded gradually but steadily during the 13 years that he was king. The stable relationship with the Western Roman Empire died with him. When Euric seized power from his brother, he changed the kingdom's relationship with the empire. Theodoric had taken advantage of the empire, but he had not allied with his fellow barbarian kings against it. Euric immediately reversed his policy, sending ambassadors to the Suebi and the Vandals. Then Anthemius arrived with a large army from the east, and Euric decided that perhaps it was not the best time to provoke the empire. To sum up, the system of orderly barbarian settlement proved its value when the Goths and the Burgundians joined Roman troops to defeat Attila. When Attila died a year later, his coalition soon broke apart. As the architect of the system, Aetius probably expected a reward from Emperor Valentinian, but was assassinated instead. Valentinian was murdered soon after, which enabled Maximus, a very ambitious senator, to declare himself emperor. However, Maximus provoked an invasion by the Vandal king Gaiseric, who sacked Rome. Angry citizens murdered Maximus, so another senator, Aetius, made himself emperor with the support of the Goths, who were allowed to expand into Hispania. Unfortunately for Aetius, the Goths proved unwilling to fight for him, so he was killed by the generals Majorian and Ricimer. Majorian became emperor, but was killed by his generalissimo Ricimer after an attempt to invade North Africa failed. Tired of Ricimer's independent nature, the Eastern emperor nominated Anthemius, an Eastern noble, as Western emperor and gave him an army. I will examine Anthemius's rule next episode. Thanks for listening. If you liked the episode and want to support me, I include a link to my Patreon in the description, or you can buy me a coffee.